through Hitler's regime, people were so filled with fear. There were people who stood up to Hitler at the time, and there were actually many attempts made on his life, and for some reason God allowed them to fail. There's one particular incident that my dad told me. There was a young fellow, he didn't want to join they had this Nazi youth group at the time, and he didn't want to be part of that, and I think he might have spoken up against some of the bad things that he saw happening, and apparently shortly after that he was found hanging from a tree outside the parents' home, and he didn't commit suicide. It was done by the Nazis, and that's how fear was put into the people. And that helped me to understand more what fear does to people. How it can paralyze a whole nation to allow things that they know are wicked and to close their eyes to what they were seeing around them. People were afraid to speak up against what was happening. When I was 3 years old, we had to leave our home. I went with my sister and one of my brothers, who was 7 at the time, and with a nanny, because my mother had stayed behind to help pack some of the things from our store. And so she was going to meet us a few days later at a certain spot. But unbeknownst to her, the Russians advanced faster than she thought, and that whole area was overrun by the Russian army, and we had to flee. The trains, we couldn't go by train anymore because the railway ties had been, I think they'd probably been damaged by our own troops so that the Russians couldn't advance as quickly. And so I ended up spending the winter, it was in the winter when we had to flee, kind of traveling from place to place with my sister, my brother, and this nanny. And just, it's amazing that God just really protected us, because I heard later on that many of these people who were fleeing were captured by the Russians, and many of the women were misused. And my sister being 12 years old, and the young lady with us, she was in her early 20s, they would have been abused by the Russians. But we were never captured, although we did meet Russian soldiers. God protected us, and many months later, when some of our railways were repaired, we were able to catch a train and carry on to where my grandparents had fled earlier. And just my sister told me something many years later, that I used to have a real hatred for Russians because of all the horrible things they did to our people. But something that she told me really helped me. She said that when we were leaving on that train, there were thousands of people trying to get on that train, and people were hanging on everywhere. And we were just jammed into the car. And she said the train started moving, and my brother was still standing on the platform, and he would have been left. And she yelled. There was apparently a Russian soldier down there, and he lifted my brother up so that he wasn't left all alone behind. And that just spoke to me that among the Russian people, there's even the soldiers, they weren't all bad. There were good people there as well. And then we were able to meet my grandparents in a town called Eisleben, which later on became the Russian sector of Germany, and it was the communist part of Germany. And so I lived there from age 4 to age 7. And yeah, it was a really hard time. It was a time when we were under communistic rule, and there was very little food, and mainly because Germany had done a lot of bad things to Russia too, which I didn't realize as a child. And so there was a lot of hatred from the Russians to the Germans, and they disowned everything. People who owned homes, the state just took them all over, and all the farms were taken over by the communist regime, run by German people, but everything had to be done according to their schedule, and nothing was run very well. There was a lot of communist propaganda telling people that things were well, and that Stalin was our father who would take care of us, and it was all a bunch of lies. And even as a child, I was only 6 maybe at the time, I recognized that maybe some of the things that my parents talked about, but I recognized that things were not good the way they were trying to tell us through the propaganda. And this was all done legally. It was the communist regime, and we couldn't really, if you spoke up, if you said anything, you would be imprisoned, or you could be beaten. And I remember my parents belonged to an evangelical Christian assembly at that time, and sometimes I knew that sometimes people were interrogated, that Russians would come at night and take people out and interrogate them, and sometimes they were beaten and they would be released. And I was always afraid that my father, who fortunately who survived the war and came back, I was always afraid that the Russians would come and take him away. And by that time I had lost my brother Dieter. He got very sick. Actually he got typhoid, and my sister also got typhoid. But they were put into hospital, and the hospitals were overcrowded at that time. And Dieter got the mumps on top of that, and my mom wasn't allowed to see him. That was so hard on my mother, because we had been separated from my mother for a few months. But anyways, yeah, so I lived under that fear as a child. And coming back to the present, what's been happening here in our country, the way I hear so many things over the news about what this COVID virus is doing to people. And in the beginning, we believed everything we were told, and we believed the numbers that they were telling us. And then the government started all these lockdowns, where businesses were closed and where we had to wear masks. And as this went on, I started to realize this isn't good. I sensed that it was more government control, that the government wanted to control our people. And it kind of, I thought, that's what was happening when I was a child under communism. And I was hearing about people getting big fines if they would take their children to a park in Toronto at that time. And so you weren't even allowed to take your children outside and play. And then schools started to be closed. And that never happened. That didn't even happen under communism. The schools were never closed. All these things that are happening in our country, and especially at what is happening lately, that some of our pastors have been imprisoned just for having a church service. One pastor, I just heard that he also lived under communism in Poland, and he was imprisoned here in Canada. He was interviewed by a police officer, and he described of how he also recognized some of the things that were happening here in Canada, and he compared them to what it was like to live under communism in Poland and how hard things were. And they were also able to escape, I think in 1989 when the communists finally fell. And how they fell was that the people of the different countries that were under the communist rule and were ruled very, very harshly, who had their properties taken away, who had to do everything that the communist government told them to do, even to the point of the kind of food that you could eat, and the way they controlled that by issuing food stamps. And when I started seeing this happening in Canada, something in my spirit said, this isn't right. And just recently I was watching a video, and it was a Christian show, and something was happening there. They had a teacher who was a really caring, loving teacher, and always worked with the children and tried to help them. And then this teacher was removed because somebody had a vendetta against her, and so she was removed temporarily and replaced by a young man who was totally different in his approach. He was very strict with the children, and this was a classroom where there were 6-year-olds up to 14-year-olds. And at one point, this teacher was giving a test to the class, and he told them all to prepare for. And there was this one little girl, a little 6-year-old girl at the front, and she was holding the pencil a certain way, and the teacher didn't like how she was holding it, and he took the pencil away from her and just broke it, so she couldn't write the test. And then she reached for another pencil that she had, and he did it again. He said, no, you've got to hold the pencil a certain way. If not, you cannot do this. And a little boy from the back stood up and ran to the front and grabbed this little girl and ran out. And as he ran out, he said, our teacher who taught us before always said, if good people do nothing, when bad things happen, bad things will continue to happen. And then the whole class followed this little boy, and they all walked out on this teacher. And things were changed after that. The teacher recognized that he couldn't handle that way. His way was not the best way. And it spoke to me, something in my spirit spoke to me, that if good people do nothing when bad things are happening, and bad things are happening in our country right now. Our country is under lockdown. Ministers are put into prison. This particular Polish minister was mistreated terribly in a prison cell. He was put into complete isolation. There was cement walls, he wasn't even given a mattress to lie on. He was forced for 30 hours, he was forced to be in this locked in room, isolated, with not even a mattress or a pillow, and he suffered terribly. There is so much injustice going on in our country. This is not right, this is not good. And he was arrested. This was done legally, and there is a time when things are done by our government and by our police that may be called legal, but that are wrong. It is time for good people to stand up and say, no more. If this goes on, we will be ruled like the way we were ruled under communism, where you had no rights, where all your property was taken away from you, and even there was not enough food for people. People were starving. It was a really hard time. I remember my mother saying to me once, she said, one of the things that I apparently prayed for as a little child, she said, oh Lord, let me have a bread that's as big as a closet. and to never have to go hungry again. And I don't want our children to have to go through time like that. And it's time for good people to stand up and say, no more. This is wrong. We have to stand up. And I'm just praying for wisdom from God as to how to do this, how to go about standing up for what we know is right and true, and that our churches will be allowed to be open again, that we'll be allowed to have as many people as want to come, that there will be no more lockdowns. Right now, our economy is being ruined, especially in our little town here in Bracebridge, Ontario. Our restaurants aren't allowed to be open. They're not even allowed to serve people on their patios, and this is wrong. We spent this winter in Florida, and the last week we're in Florida, I read an article in the St. Petersburg Times. In that article, it made comparisons between the new COVID cases that were happening in Florida, and it was compared to California, which has had lockdowns similar to what we've had in Ontario here, and the people are very, very unhappy. And the comparison was done on the population base, and they said that they found that there was no difference in the new cases between Florida and California, and that proves that all these lockdowns are doing nothing. They are just a way that the government is controlling us, and that is wrong, and we need to stand up against that and say no more.